million people, one of the financial capitals of Europe, definitely of the Iberian Peninsula. People have pretty good salaries, and the downside of all of these things is that goods are relatively expensive. You go out for a meal in the restaurant, it costs a little bit more than it would in other places. And I come actually from, I was born in a farm, a small town in Ontario, Canada, and when I go home to visit my folks, it's great because we go out to, we'll go out to a restaurant. You know, there's one restaurant in the town. It's like a restaurant, a diner. And the prices are really good. And prices are expensive in Madrid, and they're much cheaper where I come from. Why is that? The mainstream economists would look at this and they would say, well, of course prices are more expensive in Madrid in a restaurant because the restaurant owner has to cover higher rents and higher wages for employees and higher input price factors and things like this. So of course it's more expensive to have a restaurant in a big city than it is in a small town. So the output price, the final price that they sell for, has to be higher to compensate them for all of these higher costs. But of course, this doesn't make too much sense. In fact, it only pushes the problem back one level because what determines those costs, right? They're not just given to us. Something had to actually determine the price of rent to make it expensive in Madrid, and something had to determine the wages in Madrid to make them more expensive than the wages in the small town where I come from, and so on and so forth. There's a story that I like to use often in economics. I don't know if anybody read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, his 1988 book. And Hawking in there, he gives a story of a lecture that was happening in the turn of the century, attributed to Bertrand Russell, where he's talking about gravity and planets moving and things like that. And he says, you know, planets are suspended in space because of gravitational forces working on each other. And at the end of a lecture, Hawking says, a little old lady put up her hand and she says, that's a nice theory, but of course it's all wrong because everybody knows, because it's all wrong. And Russell replies, well, what do you think suspends planets in space? And the little old lady says, well, everybody knows that the Earth, for example, sits on the back of a giant turtle. And then Russell says, well, what does that giant turtle, what holds it in space? And she says, that's very clever, young man, but everybody knows it's turtles all the way down. So it's turtles from here into infinity. And it's a nice way to think about problems because, okay, we've solved the first problem. What keeps the Earth where it is? Well, there's a turtle under it. What keeps that turtle there? Turtles all the way down. Wipe your hands and go home for the night. And mainstream economists do the exact same thing because they say, well, what determines the price? Oh, it's the input costs. It's rent plus labor and all those types of things. And, well, what determines those prices? Well, of course, things that go into it. Rent is expensive in Madrid because land is very expensive. Well, why is land expensive? It's turtles all the way down. While the Austrian economists have a very unique and much more realistic and correct way of looking at the pricing process, why is a trip to the restaurant more expensive in Madrid than it would be in the small town where I'm from? Well, because people value a meal at the restaurant higher on their value scale than they do money. Why would that be? Well, it could be that salaries are higher in Madrid than they are in my small town for various reasons. And due to the law of diminishing marginal utility, if you earn more money, money will be further down on your value scale than other goods and services. So they value a restaurant at higher price points than somebody in a small town would, so people are willing to pay more. Why are wages for people who work in a restaurant higher in a city than they are in a small town? Well, because people are willing to pay more for the restaurant meal. Why are rents higher for stores that could be used as restaurants in small towns? Again, because people are willing to pay more. They value more highly the final good produced by the restaurant, so the rents are correspondingly higher. And so we have value imputed all the way back from the final valuation on the good, which will directly satisfy your want, the good being the lowest order good in Carl Menger's typology, back to the higher order goods, which are the input factors necessary to produce those goods. And I'll end my lecture here with a couple suggestions for further reading because it's a very complex, comprehensive topic. But if you ever wanted to read more, Murray Rothbard in Man, Economy and State, his first two chapters deal with, the first one is wants and preferences and the basic economic problem, and the second is this problem of exchange and the price formation process. And Carl Menger, about half of his whole principles is dedicated to this. And of course, Eugen von Bombawerk has a very nice explanation of the pricing process and where value comes from in his Positive Theory of Value. They're all available in the bookstore or online at Mises.org. Thank you. And I believe we're breaking for a half hour, and then we come back for David Gordon's thoroughly exciting lecture on praxeology. Yeah, it's a 15-minute break, so we'll meet back at the hour.